we only have 45 minutes, and we have some fantastic speakers, and we've set ourselves a rather ambitious challenge, which is to understand mathematical models, why they're important, what they're good for, what their limitations are, and how we can, as lay people, understand and use them better in 45 minutes without any PowerPoint or whiteboard. Thank you for that supportive wince from the audience. It's always encouraging for the speakers. So I'm Timandra Harkness. I am the person who was that keen. I said, we must do a session on mathematical modelling. It's really important. Somehow convinced Claire Fox that this was so. Thank you for sharing my enthusiasm. And it's also part of the scientific information strand. So the next session is on big data. I hope some of you will stay for that. I think a lot of the themes will continue. We have 3 really fantastic speakers. I can't tell you how lucky I feel we've got 3 great experts to rock up at this time on a Sunday morning and talk about mathematical modelling, not because, obviously for them it's what they do, but we're really lucky that they've come along. So I should introduce them. They're going to talk for only about 5 minutes each, and then what I may do is have a bit of a conversation up here just with them to draw out the discussion, and then over to you guys to join in and tell us what you think. So, in the order in which they are going to speak, at this end we have Dr. Robin Pursehouse, who's a lecturer at the University of Sheffield. And interestingly, he comes from an engineering background. His record is mathematical modelling in industry and academia. So he's worked for Rolls-Royce, for example. And now he's mainly working on mathematical models in public health. So he's got an ESRC, that's the Economic and Social Research Council, Future Research Leaders Award for developing new mathematical modelling techniques in social phenomena. And he's a member of the research team responsible for the Sheffield alcohol policy model. And knowing some students from Sheffield, I know that a lot of research in alcohol is done there on a practical level, but I think this is rather different. It's one of the best-known mathematical models of recent years in terms of public policy. After Robin, we're going to hear from Jonathan Rougier. Do you prefer to be called Jonty?
I'm easy with both.
It's very easy going. So he's from the University of Bristol, as you can see from his T-shirt. Now, he's a statistician whose main research area is uncertainty assessment for complex systems, which is clearly key to what we're talking about today. And he's mainly been working in environmental science, for a long time working in climate science, more recently. He puts it very dryly in his biography. He says, earth scientist on natural hazards. And yesterday we were talking about this, and it's basically volcanoes, earthquakes, the kind of things that you would see on a Channel 5 programme called Look, Here Comes Something Awful. And it's his job to actually try and work out how accurately we can predict this kind of thing. And finally, on my immediate right, Hilary Salt, who's founder of First Actuarial LLP and the firm's senior actuary. So as she was just saying, she mainly works in finance and death. So it's actually the two things in life that are certain, death and taxes. You deal with both of them.
Indeed.
Cutting against the uncertainty grain slightly. And she's also the independent actuary to the governance group of the NHS pension scheme and holds a season ticket to Old Trafford. I don't know how predictable that is. Yeah. So we're going to get short introductions from our speakers and then get stuck in, see if we can cover this whole subject in the remaining 41 minutes. So, Robin, to start us off.
Okay, thanks, Timandra. So I wanted to start with a quotation about modelling from the eminent statistician George Box, who died earlier this year at the age of 93. And he said that essentially all models are wrong, but some are useful. And in these opening remarks, I kind of want to talk about wrongness and usefulness with regard to modelling. So in terms of usefulness, if I start with that, I work in sort of the field of public health and trying to do policy appraisal, which is trying to understand the effects of policies yet to be implemented that maybe have not been implemented anywhere else. So in order to be useful in that regard, the model needs to be able to answer, or at least attempt to answer, some of the questions that are of interest to the various stakeholders involved in that particular policy question. So for alcohol and alcohol pricing, that might be things like hospital admissions on the one hand, and the extra expenditure that consumers might have to pay for their alcohol if you put up prices on the other. And they might also be interested in not knowing just for the whole population what those effects might be, but how those are split between different groups in the population, particularly people on low incomes versus people on higher incomes. So if a model is going to be useful for this type of analysis, it needs to be able to help answer those questions. So if it doesn't do that to begin with, then it's kind of failed because there's no usefulness. You can guarantee what will follow will be wrong, but it probably won't be useful. Okay, so if that's about usefulness, what I then want to go on really and talk about is wrongness. So whenever we try and model a system, the system itself is a big mess. We don't know everything that's going on in the system. It involves human behaviour, which is pretty difficult to understand and to predict. And so we have this big morass of realness, reality that we're trying to get a handle on. And we do that through a mathematical model. And the mathematical model essentially is a set of equations with some numbers in them. So there's the extent to which those equations and those numbers actually represent what's going on in the real world, and that's kind of some level of wrongness between reality and the mathematical model. But then there's also another type of wrongness, which is between the mathematical model as it exists kind of in our heads or in equations, and the computer model, which is what this session is about, which is the software or the computer code that actually implements the equations. And there can be another level of wrongness there. So you might think, okay, I've got the right equations, but then you actually go on and mess it up when you create the code. And that's quite important because there was an audit done about 10 years ago of spreadsheet models that found that 25% of them had errors in the translation of the equations into the code. And the recent controversy around Reinhardt and Rogoff's model of debt, again, was found to contain an error in the spreadsheet model. They hadn't picked up some of the countries that they needed to pick up for the analysis. So that can be a real problem as well. So we have these two kinds of wrongness. So if we've got these types of wrongness, how do we deal with it? Well, the wrongness between the real world and the equation, we do that through a process called validation that I want to talk about in a little bit more detail. And then the wrongness between the equations, the mathematical model, and the computer model is done through a process of verification, which is essentially a type of software engineering to work out whether or not the code actually implements what you think it's going to implement, and that's really important. And often that's kind of missing. So when you read papers on mathematical models, they don't really tend to describe any of those implementation aspects, but clearly that's where people mess up quite a lot of the time. But in terms of validation, which is one of the things that as a Sheffield alcohol modeller I come in for a lot of stick for on a regular basis, then there's different types of validation. And because the social world is quite messy, the type of validation that we tend to do first is an argument around, are we using the right theories? Are we using the right equations to describe what's going on in the real system? And so we can have a debate about that. So we have to actually write down what we think our theories are. We can set them out on paper. People can see them. People can argue about them. They can argue about the numbers that go in there as well. And that is a type of validation, and I argue that it's a very important type of validation. The type of validation that statisticians tend to prefer and where they get really angry that we don't do enough of this type of validation is looking at whether or not our modelling can reproduce something that's gone on in history. Now, when you're doing policy models, the policy is yet to be implemented, so really there's no actual history of it, but there might be a history of bits of the system that you're trying to understand. So there's this idea of matching history that tends to happen a lot in statistics. And then there's the real crunch, which is prediction. So can the model actually predict the future? Now, that's really hard. And it's so hard that even if the model could predict the future, you may really struggle to know if it has or not, because these type of models tend to work on one or two factors of this overall system, and they assume that all else is equal. But all else is never equal. And so the Sheffield alcohol model, for instance, will never predict population-level alcohol consumption over time. It's not built for that. It's built for predicting a little bit of that system, given that everything else is equal. And so even in order to validate that prediction, you'd have to do another piece of modelling, which is called evaluation, to try and pull out which factors have changed at which points in time. And I just want to close by talking about wrongness and how wrong is too wrong, because this is an important question for models that are used for decisions. So if you look at this table and assume that it's the spectrum of effect for alcohol policies. And on this end, we've got maybe, a minimum price for alcohol will reduce loads of hospital admissions, and it'll hardly cost consumers anything. And then at the other end, at Jonty's end, we've got, it'll actually increase hospital admissions and it'll cost consumers a fortune. Then at my end, there's kind of a trade-off of those different effects that's regarded as acceptable, such that you'd implement the policy. And at Jonty's end, we've got a trade-off between effects that's totally unacceptable and you wouldn't implement the policy. And the question is, if we've got a central modelling estimate around here, and let's say we're really amazing with our modelling, and we even manage to put some sort of confidence interval on this scale of effect, the question is, how far wrong does it have to be before you would change your decision? So as long as you're either here with me or here with Hillary on this side of sort of Tamandra, where the trade-off is okay, then you'd still implement the policy. And it's only when you get past Tamandra that you wouldn't implement the policy. So you could actually do something called sensitivity analysis and see how far you could stretch your assumptions, your input assumptions, before you go past Tamandra. And do those assumptions still look credible? Because if they don't, then even though the central modelling estimate or even the apparent confidence around that estimate is all wrong, it wasn't sufficiently wrong to change your decision. And I think I'll end it there. Thank you.
Fantastic, and dead on time. Thank you, Robin.
Thank you.
So, well, I understand you've conferred because you segued beautifully across to the statistical side, and I can reassure you that not only is Jonty a proper mathematician, when I first met him yesterday, he was sitting in the green room actually doing real sums with a pen on paper. So it's not all about
old school
computers, very old school.
Yeah.
So, Jonty, take us away.
Thank you, Tamandra, and thank you, Robin, also. My remarks are almost completely orthogonal to yours, which is a good thing, but not by design.
That means at right angles.
That's right. Okay. Thank you, Tamandra, again. Okay. Feel free to interject whenever you think I'm getting a bit technical. So my name is Jonty Ruja. I'm a statistician in the maths department at the University of Bristol. And a large part of my role is working with environmental scientists to study uncertainty assessment in environmental systems. The point that I'd like to make about models, to reiterate at some level the point that Robin has made, but also to diverge from it, is that models are abstractions, okay, obviously. Their purpose, right, is to organize the knowledge and the judgments that we have about the systems that we study. Right? That's the purpose of a model. It's organizational. And when you're looking at model output, what you're looking at essentially is a representation of the judgments and the knowledge of the modeler. Now, the thing is that in the domain where the modeler is the expert, right, his knowledge and his judgments are probably a lot more reliable than yours. So we have no reason a priori to distrust the output that we get from carefully considered scientific models constructed by domain experts. However, there is one aspect of the modeling process that always causes me some concern and alarm, and I want to talk very briefly about that. That is what I will call spurious realism. Okay? It's something that's endemic in environmental modeling, spurious realism. Suppose that we went to Hollywood and we asked Hollywood to construct for us a simulation of a large volcanic eruption. Okay? There's no doubt that what we would get back would be spectacular. Yeah? And you and I would probably be completely convinced that this was a realistic volcanic eruption. And the reason for that, of course, is because Hollywood knows precisely what you and I, non-experts, think that a volcanic eruption should look like. Yeah? However, it would be completely unconvincing to a volcanologist, and it probably wouldn't be a good platform for making predictions. Right? If we'd gone to an expert volcanologist with access to a state-of-the-art code for simulating a volcanic eruption, and we'd asked that volcanologist to produce for us a simulation of a large volcanic eruption, right? When he came back with a product and showed us what he'd done, we would see immediately that what we have is not realistic. We would see, for example, that spatially the domain had been pixelated into rectangles. We would see that time didn't progress smoothly, but it was jerky. We would see that the color scheme was completely false. he might, for example, have used a blue to red to white color scheme as a heat map, we would see that the volcano itself had very few degrees of freedom. Right? We would be in no doubt at all that what we were seeing was an artifact. It would be completely clear to us just by looking at the model output. So if a volcanologist had come to us, right, with a simulation that looked a bit Hollywood, right, that looked a bit realistic, we ought to suspect that what he's done is he's cosmetically post-processed the output, yeah, to make it seem a bit more realistic. And in post-processing the output, what he's really done, and this is the concerning issue, is that he's removed from the model output, right, those artifacts or those signals that were clues to us that what we were dealing with was indeed an abstraction and should indeed have cautioned us about putting too much weight in the conclusions of the model. Okay? So the point I would like to make about spurious realism is that when you're dealing with scientific models of complex phenomena, like environmental phenomena, it's almost paradoxical, but my view is the more realistic looking is the model output, right? The more Hollywood is the model output, right? The more cautious we ought to be in trusting the judgment of the modeler who constructed it. Okay, thank you.
Thank you for not just reading out the page of maths,
Okay.
as we joked beforehand. Hilary.
I guessed everybody else would start with a definition of what a model is, so I thought I might start with a definition of what a model isn't. And the first thing I would say a model isn't is it isn't a prediction. And I actually try to avoid the use of the word prediction when we are looking at, for example, projections of how a population might develop based on certain assumptions about mortality. All we're doing with a model is to kind of project into the future or sometimes into the past what we think are relevant assumptions about different issues and to see what would happen if those assumptions turn out to be true. So I quite like the use of the word projection because it is throwing assumptions into the future or the past to see what happens with them. And I prefer to use that over the word prediction, which I think does imply certainly to ordinary people an idea that this is something that we expect to become true, which often it isn't with a mathematical or a computer model. So I think that's the first thing that a model isn't. The second thing I think a model isn't is the answer. Often people come to statisticians to say, what's the answer to this question? And I think sometimes we need to be a bit more aware of the fact that as scientists and as mathematicians, we can show people the implications of certain decisions they wish to make or not to make and policy decisions. But what we're not there to do is to say, and therefore this is the correct policy course. We're there to say what would happen if you did this versus what would happen if you did that. On the issue of models more widely, it is interesting that there is quite a lot of disquiet around it, and I think our statistical colleagues quite rightly focus on some of the technical issues associated with models. I think it's right also just to think a little bit about some of the perhaps political or philosophical issues as well. And that's an issue I think we need to kind of unpick, certainly in the discussion here. And the first thing I wanted to talk about is the issue of anchoring. Now, people might be aware of what anchoring is. It's that people tend to start to build a model with certain ideas of the output that they expect. And if a model doesn't produce the kind of output that they expect, then they tend to look at what's wrong with the model. Now, let's just be very clear. What I'm not talking about here is people manipulating the answer to be the answer that they expect. That isn't what anchoring is. Anchoring, I think the best way to understand it is it's a bit like the placebo effect. Even when you're really aware of it and you know that it's there, it's really difficult not to fall into the trap of it. And it's doing things like, if you think the answer doesn't feel right, you recheck your calculations. Whereas if the answer feels right, you don't bother doing those checks. And that's some of the issues that we've seen come out of some of the difficulties that have arisen when people have perhaps over-relied on mathematical models. One of the things that Robin talked about was what we in certainly the financial services industry talk about best fit. So what we tend to do with our models is we build a model and then we test it against history. And I think in some ways we are in a better position than some people looking at things like climate change, where it's difficult to fit it to the past. You know, we often have very good data about what's happened in the past. And we tend to run our models to fit what's happened in the past. But actually, if you test a model on past data, it almost inevitably leads to a position where what your model produces for a projection of the future is very similar to what's happened in the past. And that is a significant limitation, I think, of models. That's particularly an issue when we think about models that involve human behaviour and forecasting what people will do in certain situations is always much more difficult than forecasting what molecules might do, for example, if temperature increases. Human beings are just not like that. One of the failures of some of our financial models recently have been that they didn't take into account the fact that even when government bonds are yielding a rate of return that's negative in real terms, which they are now with the effects of quantitative easing, we didn't model the fact that people might still buy them, and people are still buying them in large quantities. Largely as a risk reduction factor, but we didn't think about that. So those are some of the issues I thought we might concentrate on. The other thing I think is perhaps interesting to think about is the way that models are presented to the public. And I know that quite a few people have done a lot of work in terms of looking at how models might be better explained to the public. One of the things that we tend to do in the finance industry is we'll run a stochastic model, a model that runs thousands and thousands of different possibilities of what might happen. We'll then cut out the worst 5% and the top 5% of the results of those models, and that's what we'll present to clients as possible projections of the future. And actually, that's been really problematic for us in the past, not last year, but the 3 years preceding that, because the 3 years preceding that, the results were the things that we cut out of our presentation to our clients, because they were kind of 1 in 20-year events that we certainly didn't expect to happen 3 times on the run. So, given time, I think I'd perhaps just switch to one point that I think we do need to cling on to in all this, though, because I think there's a real danger that when people understand all the difficulties associated with models, they start to become very sceptical and very cynical about them, and to say that actually models are no use to us, models are not helpful to us in making policy decisions or understanding the past or the future. And I think it's important to really cling on to the fact that models can be helpful and can be useful if their limitations are described and understood. Perhaps just to go back to where I started, I think the best way to understand the value and the limitation of models is to understand that they are projections rather than predictions. Thank you.
Marvellous, and still within time. Well, just before I do come out to the audience to see what they think, I just wanted to pick up on something that Hilary mainly has said about how these things are seen in the public. And I don't know how many chances you two, Jonty and Robin, get to talk directly to the public. Obviously a self-selecting group of the public who wanted to be here on a Sunday morning to talk about mathematical modelling, but still to people who I'm assuming, well, let's just have a show of hands. Who would say they do not work with computer modelling in their everyday work? Okay, so you've got quite a few real people here.
Normal people.
Listen, hey, I'm the one who is saying to Hilary, if I start talking about bays, slap me. I love this stuff. But you've got a real opportunity here to actually get across to people the dirty nitty-gritty, the problematic side, and yet at the same time convince them, as Hilary says, that in fact we really need these models to be able to plan the future, to be able to understand the world that we live in. So what are the kind of things that we can use to critically, as lay people, how can we critically look at things that we read in the media that are presented as you say, as predictions? How can we kind of dig back from that a bit? What kind of questions should we be asking? I'm kind of asking for your insider tips, I suppose. As a layperson, I open the newspaper, I say, with the alcohol example, if this is the minimum price, then 6,321 lives will be saved, or or, there's obviously climate models are much more complex, but we still get headline figures. What are the kind of questions that we can usefully ask to feel that we can put some confidence in these models, or that we have an idea of where the confidence should end? If that's not too big a question.
Okay, yeah, you're looking at me, so I guess you want me to say something, Tim Andrew. So I think that the way in which models are represented in the public and through the media is really important, and has actually kind of been. I've had a deep frustration sometimes about how that happens. So with the alcohol work, we essentially publish central estimates, and then we publish a set of sensitivity analyses looking at other credible assumptions around inputs and how far things might have to go wrong before you would change decisions around the model. And when certainly there's a tendency for those to get picked up on as central estimates, and two things happens. One is that there's kind of spurious levels of confidence given by some of the detail around that, as you've said, predictions to the nearest death of a model over 10 years, which is nonsense. The other issue is the use of examples. I know there's a whole different session about how the media represents evidence later, but I think that media like to use examples that make sense to people, so they might transform fairly abstract outputs from the model into things that people can grab hold of. So it might be, in the case of alcohol, this might be a bottle of wine, say. So it might be that this would reduce drinking by 2 bottles of wine a month or whatever. I've just made that up. But they try and represent it in terms of that. And that hides in itself so much uncertainty, because the strength of a bottle of wine can vary considerably. And the strength of beer as well can vary considerably. And so even by turning what was an abstract model output into a specific example that's easy to understand, there's another element of wrongness that's sort of come into the picture. And, I worry about how that gets interpreted inside people's heads. Are people thinking about, okay, yeah, well, there was some model output with uncertainty. It's turned into some representation that's suitable for people to understand quickly, that's introduced further uncertainty. Is any of that appreciated? I do worry about that quite a lot. Can I just say one more thing before I finish on this? So I earlier on in this year, I attended a Science Media Centre briefing where there was a panel of people trying to explain issues around alcohol policy to a bunch of journalists, and we had about 45 minutes to do it, and that was great, because normally you have 5 minutes maybe maximum and everything's compressed. And I think the idea of those sessions is to try and allow people to think for a longer period of time and ask more detailed questions about what's going on. And I actually found that I was sceptical about whether it would work, but I actually found it quite refreshing, because in the next day's Daily Telegraph and Daily Mail, there was a sentence that actually acknowledged the uncertainty in the estimates that came out of the Sheffield alcohol model. And I thought that was quite, it might be a small step, but I thought that was quite, a positive step at trying to represent some of this uncertainty in a sensible way rather than a hysterical way in the public. Okay.
Did you want to say something?
I just thought I might share with you, my professional institute has issued a technical actuarial standard, or TAS, on modelling, and they have a list of all the things that you should accompany a model with when you're presenting it. So I will run through it very quickly. So the list is what's been left out, what assumptions have been made, whether the programming works, that's the wrongness that Robin talked about, the sensitivity to different assumptions, how suitable the model is for purposes other than those it was built for, and that's often particularly a model that might have been built for professional use. When it gets into the public arena, becomes unsuitable. How systemic risks have been modelled, how many realisations have been used, how many times you run the model, and how many checks have been run. So that's probably a good checklist to use in judging models.
I think that sounds great, but the issue there is how long would it take to communicate all of that information? And would people switch off before you've got sort of past that second bit in your list? And so I think this is great, but I guess my question would be, how would you if you only had a minute, how would you prioritise the message that you're giving there?
Maybe what we need is that every member of the public should be given this list and say, right, whenever somebody says we've modelled this and this is the outcome, you whip your little list out and see if you can find out the answers to these questions. Don't you? Did you want to throw something in?
I just have a brief observation on this subject, which is that the expertise, right, resides in the scientist, the modeler, right? That's he or she is the domain expert, right? The model that we see and the outputs that we look at, they are one representation of the expert's knowledge and judgment. Now, the problem with this viewpoint is that subjectivity is seen by unenlightened people, let's say, as almost the antithesis of good science, right? And it is tempting for the expert to downplay the subjectivity of his model, to downplay the fact that it is a representation of his judgments and his knowledge, right, by investing the model with an objectivity that it doesn't necessarily have. And my concern about spurious realism is it's one of the ways in which you make your model seem more objective than it really is. So the key thing for me is to remember that it's the expert who has the domain knowledge that you should value, not the output from the model. And if you find an expert putting too much emphasis on his or her model, then that's what should make you cautious.
Thank you very much. Right, now we have 15 minutes just about to bring you guys in. Since we have, I think, a really stunning panel of expertise here, do feel free to just ask questions.
I organised some seminars for Transport Statistics Users Group. We did one on forecasting for HS2. I had a look at it, and it turned out that 2/3 of the growth was going to come from transfer from domestic air transport and 1/3 from car. And in fact, you're going to have twice as much traffic as is currently domestic air traffic. So in other words, yes, if it grows at 3.5% compound over 40 years and it grows up fourfold, well, I won't bore you with the maths. Basically, it needs quite heroic growth, and car far less so. Now, I was always interested when I was studying computers. We had something called GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. And what worries me is the actual mathematical models may be fine, but you put them in. If you put wrong assumptions in, you're going to get problems. Now, another thing, another moral is I edit a magazine called The Transport Economist, and I look at economists saying the cost-benefit analysis for HS2 is such and such. Well, I think I know why it is. It's because they say, oh, well, the savings will be 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 40 minutes. Now, actually, if you look at it, there'll be less than that because you've actually got to get there. And the reason it's faster because it stops at further intermediate points. I don't want to get too scientific, but it seems pretty obvious to me that you've got economists who are taking figures that are probably incorrect and then applying their models to it and coming up with something that's a little bit wrong. You've got statisticians which are taking things very questionable. And another thing, because I'm really taking still on this question.
This is your last point, right?
Definitely my last point. With HS1, that's the line that goes down to the channel. I was talking with someone involved. He said, well, we did it. It didn't produce an acceptable economic rate. And they said, could you improve things? So we increased the forecast demand. We doubled it, in fact. Interestingly enough, it's now currently got half the level of demand that they forecast. Now, maybe there's a lesson there.
So basically, if you adjust your model to fit the desired outcomes, then it won't fit the real world. Yeah, stand up. Unless you're here in secret.
Yeah, I'm here in secret. It's a question on modelling in humanitarianism. It's sort of been seen as a sort of a big solution, but there is a sort of nervousness in humanitarian circles about that because it's coming on a sort of dehumanising of humanitarianism because the very idea of models and abstractions, they're sort of abstractions of what? In the context of where modelling is seen as a big solution, where aid agencies are actually abstracting themselves from communities because of risk management, because of the real dangers. And so there's a real concern in humanitarianism that modelling is becoming a substitute for actually knowing the communities, or it's becoming a form of knowing communities abstracted from any sort of human contact or only virtual contact.
That's very interesting, thanks. And Sandy Starr, who's actually speaking on the panel for the big data session, which is in here next.
It's a related point, and it's related to big data. I'm interested in the implications of what all the speakers were saying for the status of the social sciences. The best-selling sort of popularisation of big data, the book that's out at the moment, goes into some detail on how random sampling in the 20th century and now big data possibilities in the 21st century have really helped the transition from disciplines from being humanities to being proper social sciences, and presents this as a good news story. And I do worry. I mean, I'm a little old-fashioned. I worry about natural philosophy having become science, so I'm obviously out of step. But I do worry that it's not entirely a good news story and that something has been lost there. I don't want to impugn completely the empirical side and the empirical claims of the social sciences, but it seems to me that a lot of the assumptions that go into creating and testing provisional models of the world, a lot of those assumptions are hidden or elided, and a lot of useful hypothesis-driven thinking gets lost in the emphasis on data and in the emphasis on models. I think what the speakers are saying is fantastic and possibly casting a light on some of this, and I'm very interested in what they think about it.
How useful is data analysis and statistical relationships to actual real relationships, or the understanding of real world relationships? Because I think the point that you made, that in reality all statistical relationships are simply an abstract artifact, so therefore they aren't part of the real world. Yet we seem in public policy and even in the sciences, medical sciences, where there seems to be an element where people have lost the distinction between statistical relationships and the real-world relationships and causality.
Keep the questions small, why don't you?
Before I entered the private sector, I used to teach graduate and undergraduate statistics and research methods, and I applaud your list of things to look at. One of the things that I did with my students was it was not necessary to memorize any of those damn formulas. We don't memorize them either. But I find I'd like to suggest that you add something to the list. And that was something that I encouraged my students to do when they started to look at any statistical claim. It's Columbo, follow the money. Who is funding the study? And go back 2 levels. Find out who, if it's the National Heritage Foundation of Americans for Concerned Americans, find out who's funding those. That will give you a lot of information about the assumptions upon which the model was built and the types of relationships that were looked at and how the findings were reported.
You talked about checking your models with historic data, and sometimes you have that luxury, but in many cases you don't because you're looking at policy. But how often when policy is implemented is the model looked at subsequent to the policy being implemented to see what the failings of the model were in order to refine things maybe for future policy? I'm particularly aware of the air pollution and health policy and models, and I know there's some work being done post-implementation, but I'm not sure that's a general thing that people do. They ignore them, particularly if they don't work. And just talking about the HS1 and HS2, clearly people have ignored the HS1 analysis
to HS2.
For HS2.
Would you, each of the panellists, prefer for there to be more stories out there in the media about the statistical conclusions that you're coming up with, although for them to be less rigorously tested, or for there to be sort of more of a body of knowledge to be built up before they're then reported, so there'd be fewer stories out there, but there'd be a larger consensus and about the actual results?
Wow, all these questions are very big and profound. I can tell you now, we're not going to be able to answer all of them. We'll have a go.
People in the media, lay people, policymakers tend to want answers to things, and we understand that modelling doesn't give you answers, it gives you degrees of uncertainty. And I'm wondering how you sell uncertainty as a concept, as a subject, if you like, to people who aren't who see science not as a thing of uncertainty, but as a thing of right answers, and how you sort of square that circle.
An associate to the Open Data Institute here in London. My question is quite short. I mean, after everything you described today, I wonder how safe it is to give data and models in the hands of common people like me. On one side, I promote and I believe that it's good to have data, to have model, to share. On the other side, it looks like it can be incredibly misleading in the wrong hands. What is your opinion?
Well, there you are. Data as dynamite. Okay, now, strictly speaking, you now have a minute each to answer all those points, questions, and sum up. I will be a little lenient. We can plead that the person in the room that should have shown me the yellow card failed to do so. Don't tell anyone. Edit that bit out. Shall we go in the same order we started with? Don't obviously feel that you have to answer everything, but any points that you think you can usefully pick up on, please do. And if we didn't answer your point, you'll have to stay for the next discussion on big data.
Okay, yeah, so I think there are different types of model. So there's like decision models that are used for policy, but there's other types of models that are used for much more theoretical work and actually trying to understand different theories. They could be social theories. So for example, one well-known one is Schelling's segregation model, where he built quite an abstract model of how segregation arises in a city. And he wasn't trying to predict segregation in any particular city to begin with. He was just trying to look at how those effects might arise out of some dynamic. So he's actually doing social theorizing in effect. So that is, I think, contributing towards less quantitative, to a certain extent, certainly less data-oriented modelling. So I think I'm a bit unapologetic about quantitativeness to a certain extent, in that I think it's good to be able to write some mathematics down, some equations that actually pinpoint what is that causal process that you're trying to specify. Even if you're trying to specify it linguistically, can you write it down? And I think that's useful and is used to develop theories well away from looking at historical validations or projections or predictions. The other thing that I thought was important from an evidential perspective, there's a point about should we wait? So should we push more and more modelling results or more data into the public domain, or should we wait for some of this uncertainty to be reduced? There's a cost involved in waiting. So if you don't take a decision now, depending on what the topic is, say you've got some sort of vaccine that's experimental and you want to apply it to stop an epidemic. Well, if you don't apply it within a certain amount of time, there could be big costs associated with you looking around for further certainty. And I think that those costs are sometimes forgotten. I think that in public health as well, you are never going to get an evidential standard that is the same as what you will get from randomized controlled trials. The world is too messy to ever achieve that level of evidential certainty. And that community, interestingly, you can see how that's reflected in their values. So, for example, you could look at an evidential standard of proof at 99%, say, or 95%. Typically in public health, they're more like 50%. On the balance of probabilities, will this work? And then once it's implemented, they'll try and make it work. Because that's the messy world that they're working in, and that's quite different to the world of big pharma and big data to a certain extent.
Fantastic.
Okay.
Thanks, Robin.
Yes, so there's several issues for the statistician to pick up on, but given the shortage of time, I'm just going to look at one. The lady at the front mentioned the issue of humanitarian modelling and aid. Just a reflection on my own experience working with avalanche modellers. I won't mention the site, but there's a very good avalanche modelling team that handles daily avalanche risk assessment for a large ski resort. And that currently consists of men and women who go out and dig snow pits and look at the friability of the snow and so on, and make a subjective judgment based upon years of experience on what causes ice packs and snow packs to become unstable. That's now changing because of a worry about personal liability. Yep. These people are worried that if they make a decision and it turns out that there is an avalanche where they said the snowpack would be safe, that they will be personally liable. And of course, we've seen examples recently of scientists who have been held personally liable for their predictions. And one of the temptations is to switch to a model-based framework because it seems as though no one is liable. Yep. But that is the thing that we must avoid, because models are nothing more, right, as I said twice already, than an artifact for organizing knowledge and judgment. So we must remember that there is always someone behind a model. And if we want our experts to be honest in their opinions, and they are the domain experts, we must change our culture so that we don't blame people when they've used their knowledge and their judgment to make the best possible assessment, and it hasn't worked out quite the way that they thought it would.
Lovely, thanks, Chauncey. And Hilary, you get the last word.
It's hard to answer everything. Perhaps just to concentrate on one point, and that is, we've seen a real switch over the past 10 years from what I'd call deterministic models to stochastic models. So rather than run a model that says, for example, in the financial world, you might run a model that says, what if there's a boom? What if there's a recession? What if we have a repeat of the last 10 years? What if we have a reversal of the past 10 years? And those would be deterministic models. And at one point, we would have relied fairly heavily on those. Whereas now, we model 10,000, 100,000 possibilities of what might happen in the future and say we'll assume something around the middle of those. And it does seem to me that that's a bit of an example of where our lack of confidence in our ability to understand the world gets translated into the way that we use models. And I think on the humanitarian organisations questions, that's a bit the same. It's a bit the same in the reverse, because you don't have any confidence in your ability to understand the world, you then look for a model to give you the answer. Strangely, that model is a model that's built on a lack of understanding of the world, so it does all get very, very circular. Perhaps that's the main point I'd like to make.
Thank you all very much for coming out and for your very interesting points and questions, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the day. So please thank our fantastic panel for giving us their time.